I don't know why I'm telling this. Honestly, I don't even know if I'll make sense by the end of it, but I need to get it out, you know? Maybe someone else will understand. Maybe it'll just help me sleep better at night. Anyway, here goes. It was about 6 months ago, and I wasn't even supposed to be out that night. I had a pretty bad week at work. My boss was riding me, deadlines were piling up, and I'd barely slept. So, when Greg texted me about this old arcade he'd found, I wasn't really in the mood. But Greg's that kind of guy, you know? He can get excited about anything. I guess he just has that kind of energy. And when you're friends with someone like that, you find yourself saying yes to things, even when every fiber of your being is telling you to say no. He picks me up around 8. It was a typical Saturday night. Fall was settling in, so it was getting darker earlier. We're driving through the city, and Greg's going on about this arcade like it's some kind of hidden treasure. He's saying stuff like, they've got all the original machines, man. Real stuff like before they started charging $1 a game, we could stay there all night for like $10. I wasn't really listening at first, just kind of zoning out and watching the streetlights blur past the window. But when we pulled into the parking lot, that's when I first got this weird feeling in my gut. The place wasn't right. It was tucked into this strip mall. You know the type. Half the stores were closed, the rest looked like they'd been forgotten by time. Some flickering lights, cracked asphalt in the parking lot, and the arcade itself was squeezed between an old laundromat and a pawn shop. Its sign just said play in bright neon letters, but one of the letters wasn't working, so it blinked on and off every few seconds. And man, the place was quiet. Like, weirdly quiet. There wasn't any of that buzz you expect when you walk into an arcade, no beeping or chattering or anything. Just this oppressive silence hanging in the air. I remember standing there by the car, staring at the building and feeling like I should just get back in and go home. I can't explain it. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like this deep sense that we shouldn't be there. But Greg, he's already halfway to the door, so what am I gonna do? I follow him. When we walk in, the first thing I notice is the smell. It's that stale, musty air, like nobody's opened a window in years. The place was dark, too, not completely. There were a few flickering lights overhead, just enough to see, but everything felt off. There was this hum coming from the machines, but it wasn't like normal arcade noise. It was more like a drone, a low, constant buzz that just gnawed at my nerves. Greg, of course, was ecstatic. "Dude, check this out!" he yells, running over to this ancient Pac-Man machine. He's talking a mile a minute about how cool it is, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was too busy scanning the room. There were maybe 5 other people there, scattered around the machines, but they weren't like us. They weren't laughing or chatting or even moving much. Each one of them was hunched over a machine, staring blankly at the screens. I don't know why, but something about the way they sat, perfectly still, their faces barely visible in the dim light, it just felt wrong. Like they were stuck there, locked into the machines, as if they'd been playing for years. I tried to shake it off. I mean, I didn't want to sound crazy to Greg. So I wandered over to a Galaga machine, figuring maybe I'd just play around, calm my nerves. But the minute I put the quarter in, that feeling in my gut hit me again, hard. It wasn't even about the game anymore. Something about the air in that place. It felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and I couldn't focus. I glanced back at Greg. He was still all in on his Pac-Man game, completely oblivious. But what really got me was when I looked at the other players again. This time they were different. None of them were playing. They were just sitting there, still as statues, staring at the screens with this blank, glazed-over look. I can't explain it, but it was like they weren't real. Or maybe they'd stopped being real. My heart started pounding in my chest. I kept trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly, horribly wrong. I walked over to Greg, trying to keep my voice steady. "Greg, man, let's go. Seriously." He didn't even look at me. "What? Dude, we just got here. Chill out." But I couldn't chill out. My hands were shaking and my legs felt like they were about to give out from under me. I looked around one more time, and that's when I saw it. Something or someone standing at the back of the room. At first I thought it was just another player, but they weren't like the others. They weren't sitting at a machine. They were standing completely still, watching us, watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, heavy and cold. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I grabbed Greg's arm. "We need to go. Now." He finally saw the look on my face and stopped messing around. All right, geez, what's your deal? We turned to leave, but as we walked past the rows of machines, I noticed something that nearly made my legs give out. All the screens, the Pac-Man, the Galaga, the Street Fighter, all of them had turned to static. There were no games, no sounds, just pure flickering static. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I glanced back one last time, and there, standing at the entrance of the arcade, was the figure from before. This time I could see them more clearly, and I swear they were smiling. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. We got to the car and Greg floored it out of the parking lot without asking any more questions. I didn't look back. I couldn't. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that something from that place followed me. I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I even went back to the strip mall once just to see if maybe, I don't know, to prove to myself it wasn't real. But when I got there, the arcade was gone. No sign, no building, nothing. Just an empty space where it had been. I haven't talked to Greg about it since. We both just kind of pretend it never happened. But I still see that figure sometimes, in my dreams or in the corner of my eye when I'm alone at night. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we'd stayed longer? My name is David Granger. This story, well, it happened a little over a year ago and I still can't shake it. I wasn't even going to share it with anyone because honestly it sounds too weird to be true. But the more I think about it, the more I feel like I need to talk about it. Because maybe, just maybe, someone else has gone through something similar. It was a Friday evening. I remember it so clearly because I'd had one of those long, draining weeks at work. You know the kind, where everything that could go wrong does go wrong, and you're counting down the minutes until the weekend. By the time I left the office, I was mentally checked out. I wasn't in the mood for much, but my buddy Mark had been texting me all day, trying to convince me to hang out. Mark's this outgoing guy, always looking for something fun to do, and that night he had this idea to hit up an arcade. Now we're both in our late 20s, so I hadn't been to an arcade since, I don't know, middle school. But there's this retro spot downtown that he swore by, said it was full of classic games, a great place to just relax and blow off some steam. I didn't want to seem like a downer, so I gave in. The arcade was called Level Up. It was tucked between a closed-down diner and an old laundromat, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were specifically looking for it. The neon sign flickered above the door, and the windows were plastered with faded posters from the early 90s, advertising old tournaments for games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. It was a time capsule, really. When I walked in, I was hit with this overwhelming sense of nostalgia, the sound of pinball machines clanging, the low hum of conversation, and the smell of greasy pizza. It wasn't packed, but there were a decent number of people milling around, most of them around my age, probably trying to relive their childhood like we were. Mark was already there, of course. He was playing Tekken on one of the machines near the back, completely in his element. "Dude!" he shouted when he saw me. "Finally! You're missing out!" He waved me over, grinning ear to ear. I could tell he was already on a high from winning a few rounds. I smiled, trying to shake off the exhaustion. Yeah, let me catch up," I said, laughing as I dropped a few quarters into the game beside him. We spent the next hour or so bouncing from game to game. Galaga, Time Crisis, Street Fighter, the usual. It was fun, but after a while, I needed a break. I wandered over to the snack counter to grab a soda, and that's when I noticed something. In the far corner of the arcade, there was this machine I hadn't seen before. It wasn't like the others. It didn't have a flashy marquee or big artwork on the side. It just sat there, unassuming, with a blank screen. Honestly, I don't even know why it caught my eye, but something about it seemed off. I walked over to check it out. Up close, it looked old. Not just retro, but old. The kind of thing you'd expect to see in a museum, not an arcade. The screen was dark, the buttons worn down, and the joystick was practically falling apart. There was no name on it, no label, just this plain wooden cabinet. At first I thought it was broken, but then I noticed the coin slot. It had that little red light on, the one that tells you it's still accepting quarters. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to be paying attention to it. Mark was still lost in his game, and everyone else was busy with their own thing. I don't know why, but I was curious. Maybe I just wanted to see if it still worked. I pulled out a quarter, dropped it into the slot, and nothing. For a second, I thought I'd just wasted my money. But then, the screen flickered. It wasn't like the other machines where the game boots up with music or an intro screen. This one just lit up. It showed this grid, kind of like a maze, but the lines were jagged, almost like they weren't finished. The graphics were basic, like something from the early 80s, but there was something weirdly unsettling about it. There was no press start or anything like that. Just this blinking cursor at the beginning of the maze. I figured it was some kind of old-school puzzle game, so I grabbed the joystick and moved the cursor. It was stiff, like really hard to control. But after a few tries, I got it to move. The goal seemed simple enough: navigate the maze. But as I moved through the maze, it started to change. The walls shifted. They would close off paths I'd already taken and open new ones that weren't there before. It was like the game was adjusting to me. I kept playing, but the further I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. I don't know how to describe it, but there was this growing sense of unease, like I wasn't alone. Like someone, or something, was watching me. At first, I thought it was just in my head. Maybe I was tired, or... The screen flickered again. This time it wasn't just the maze changing. My reflection appeared. Faint at first, but there in the black background of the game, I could see myself. I stopped, my hand frozen on the joystick. I tried to tell myself it was just the glass reflecting, but it didn't make sense. The angle, the way I was standing, it wasn't lining up. And the longer I stared, the more I realized my reflection wasn't doing what I was doing. It was staring back at me. I felt this cold shiver run down my spine. I let go of the joystick and stepped back, but my reflection stayed right there, grinning. It wasn't me. I mean, it looked like me, but the expression, it was wrong. I turned to call Mark, but he wasn't there anymore. In fact, the entire arcade had gone silent. No buzzing machines, no chatter, no clinking of quarters, just dead silence. "Mark?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt wrong, like it had changed without me noticing. Everything was still there, the games, the lights, but it was like I was somewhere else entirely. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on me. And then I heard it. A low humming sound coming from the machine behind me. I turned back to the screen and the maze was gone. The screen was black, but I could still see my reflection. Only this time, it wasn't grinning, it was moving. It reached out, pressing its hands against the glass as if trying to push through. I stumbled back, tripping over one of the stools. My mind was racing. What the hell was happening? Was I losing it? I ran to the front door, but it wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, banging on the glass, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel my chest tightening, my breaths coming faster. Panic set in. Suddenly, the lights in the arcade flickered, and when I turned back to the machine, my reflection was gone. The screen was off. The machine was silent. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at it, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the front door opened, and Mark came rushing back in, asking me where the hell I'd gone. I never told him what I saw. I just grabbed my stuff and left. I've been back to that part of town since, but the arcade, it's gone, like it never existed. I still can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But even now, whenever I walk past an arcade, I get this tight feeling in my chest, like something's watching me from the corner, something waiting.